So we have to stop pretending that countries that just hold an election where sometimes the winner somehow magically gets 90% of the vote because all the opposition is locked up.
We as an IDU, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of Tundu Lissu.
Elections this week in Tanzania have sparked widespread protests, leading to the deployment of the military and an internet shutdown.
Tanzania continues to be under a communications blackout after protests marred the presidential polls in the East African nation.
Now to Tanzania, where authorities have imposed curfews and an internet blackout as post-election protests sweep the country. Demonstrators have clashed with police in several cities following Wednesday's general election.
Jailed Tanzanian and Ugandan opposition leaders Tundu Lissu and Kizza Besigye have been recognized as champions of democracy in Africa.
In the heart of East Africa, a nation long seen as a beacon of stability is teetering on the edge. Tanzania, a country of breathtaking landscapes and a proud history, is now filled with a different kind of energy, one born of frustration and a deep-seated fear for its democratic future. The catalyst? A single political decision that has shaken the state to its core. The government has effectively silenced its most formidable opponent, Tundu Lissu, a man who became a symbol of resistance for millions. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was a move that pushed the nation to a breaking point. In response, some of the most widespread and violent protests in the country's multi-party era have erupted, and the government is now trying Lissu for treason. This is the story of how one man's fight for his political life has become a nation's struggle for its soul. The recent history of Tanzania can be split into two periods, before October 2025 and after. Leading up to the general election, the political atmosphere was already thick with tension. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, who took office in 2021 after her predecessor's death, was seeking her first full term. Initially, her presidency brought cautious optimism. She lifted a ban on political rallies and made conciliatory moves toward the opposition, earning her international praise. But as the election neared, that hope began to fade. The first major blow came when the country's two main opposition presidential candidates were systematically removed from the race. First, Luhaga Mpina of the ACT Wazalendo party was disqualified. Then came the decisive move against Tundu Lissu, the charismatic leader of Chadema, the largest opposition party. In April 2025, Lissu was arrested and charged with treason, a crime that can carry the death penalty. The state argued a speech he gave calling for electoral reforms was actually an incitement to rebel. Shortly after, his party, Chadema, was disqualified from the election for refusing to sign an electoral code of conduct, a move Lissu resisted without what he called meaningful reforms to a system heavily skewed in the ruling party's favor. A court injunction also barred Chadema's leaders from political activities. With the two most credible challengers gone, the election became a foregone conclusion. On November 1st, President Hassan was declared the winner with a reported 97.66% of the vote. For many Tanzanians, this wasn't a victory. It was a declaration of one-party dominance. The response was immediate and visceral. Protests, something that had become almost unthinkable under years of tightening repression, erupted across the country. From the commercial hub of Dar es Salaam to cities like Mwanza and Mbeya, citizens took to the streets, clashing violently with security forces. The government's reaction was swift and brutal. The military was deployed, live ammunition was used on crowds, and a nationwide internet blackout was imposed. While the government has downplayed the numbers, opposition parties and human rights groups have reported multiple deaths and mass arrests. As of early November 2025, authorities had charged more than 200 people with treason in connection to the protests and issued arrest warrants for other senior opposition figures. Tanzania hadn't just banned its most popular politician, it had declared war on dissent itself. To understand why the government went to such extreme lengths to sideline one man, you have to understand who Tundu Lissu is. He's not just another politician. For many, he is the living embodiment of defiance. A lawyer by trade, Lissu built his career fighting for the rights of the marginalized, taking on powerful corporations and defending communities whose land was being taken. His sharp legal mind and refusal to be intimidated made him a prominent and vocal critic of the government within his party, Chadema. But his opposition came at a terrible price. In 2017, in the administrative capital of Dodoma, Lissu's car was riddled with bullets in a brazen assassination attempt. He was shot 16 times. Miraculously, he survived, but the attack forced him into exile in Belgium for years of grueling medical treatment. The bullets that failed to kill him instead forged him into a symbol of resilience. He became the man who stared death in the face and refused to back down. His return to Tanzania in 2020 to run for president was met with a hero's welcome. He campaigned vigorously against the incumbent, John Magufuli, in an election widely seen as flawed. After the election, facing new threats, he once again left the country, but his influence never waned. When President Samia Suluhu Hassan took power, there was a brief window where dialogue seemed possible. Lissu returned in early 2023 to massive crowds ready to engage. But his central demand remained unchanged. Tanzania needed a new constitution and real electoral reforms to ensure a level playing field. He launched a No Reforms, No Elections campaign, holding rallies across the country to make his case. It was this very campaign, this mobilization of public demand for genuine democracy, that the state deemed treasonous. In court, Lissu has acted as his own lawyer, turning his trial into a public forum on the nature of democracy. In one defiant address, he argued that his words were protected political speech, not a crime, asking the judges, opposing those in power in a country with a multi-party political system is not a criminal offense. Even if it is a criminal offense, is it treason deserving of hanging someone? His trial, plagued by repeated postponements, has been described by human rights groups as politically motivated. The court even banned live coverage of the proceedings, a move critics say is designed to hide the weakness of the state's case. Tundu Lissu is popular not just for his politics, but because his personal story mirrors the struggle of Tanzanian democracy itself. Wounded, forced into exile, but stubbornly refusing to die. The events of 2025 didn't happen in a vacuum. They're the culmination of a long-term project by one of Africa's most enduring ruling parties, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM. To really get why Tanzania is at a breaking point, you have to look at the system CCM has built. The party has been in power since independence in 1961, making it one of the longest ruling political forces on the continent. And while multi-party politics were reintroduced in 1992, CCM never truly let go of the reins. Unlike some of its neighbors, Tanzania's political culture has been one of managed consensus and stability above all else. The party and the state are deeply intertwined, creating what analysts call a hegemonic party system, where opposition can exist, but it's never allowed to pose a real threat. Under President John Magufuli from 2015 to 2021, this system took a sharp authoritarian turn. Nicknamed the Bulldozer, Magufuli launched an anti-corruption campaign but also oversaw a brutal crackdown on dissent. Media outlets were shut down, civil society was strangled, and opposition figures were arrested, abducted, and in cases like Tundu Lissu's, nearly killed. When Samia Suluhu Hassan came to power, many hoped she would reverse this trend. Her initial reforms, like lifting the ban on political rallies, suggested a move toward regaining international credibility. But as the 2025 election approached, the calculus seems to have shifted. Fearing the opposition's growing popularity, the administration reverted to the old playbook of control. Repression intensified dramatically. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented a horrifying pattern of abuse, including enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary arrests targeting anyone deemed a threat. The treason charge against Lissu and the disqualification of his party weren't just about winning an election. They were about reasserting CCM's absolute dominance and sending a message that no challenge would be tolerated. This crisis is about more than just one man or one party. It's about the systemic erosion of the very institutions meant to guarantee a fair democratic contest. According to outside observers, the 2025 election wasn't just anti-competitive, it was fundamentally compromised. The African Union's Election Observation Mission delivered a deeply critical preliminary verdict. The mission concluded that the elections did not comply with AU principles, normative frameworks, and other international obligations and standards for democratic elections. Observers noted a range of serious issues: a legal framework that falls short of democratic standards, the failure to implement past reforms, ballot stuffing, and the internet shutdown on election day. Their conclusion was stark: the entire process had been compromised. This institutional decay extends to the judiciary, which many now see as a tool of political enforcement rather than an impartial arbiter. And security forces have been used not to maintain public order, but to violently suppress peaceful protest. Layered on top of this political rot are deep economic and social grievances. While President Hassan's government can point to stable economic growth, its policies, like a controversial tax on mobile money transactions, have hit ordinary Tanzanians hard. This combination of political exclusion, institutional decay, and economic frustration has created a volatile mix. The protests are an expression of a deeper public anger at a system seen as fundamentally unjust. The main message from the protesters, a majority of whom are young, is a demand for an end to electoral injustice and rising authoritarianism. With nearly 77% of Tanzania's population under the age of 35, there's a massive generational disconnect between an aging political establishment and a youth demanding change. The question now hanging over Tanzania is whether this is just a moment of anger or a genuine breaking point. The scale and intensity of the protests are unprecedented in the country's multi-party era. For over 30 years, Tanzania avoided the kind of widespread political violence that has plagued some of its neighbors. That peace appears to be over. The government's response has only escalated the crisis. By blaming the unrest on foreigners and doubling down on repression, President Hassan's administration has shut the door on dialogue. Charging large numbers of protesters with treason is a high-stakes gamble. It could terrorize the population into submission, or it could backfire, creating more martyrs and radicalizing a populace that feels it has nothing left to lose. The international reaction has been mixed. While human rights organizations and some Western nations have voiced concern, the regional response has been more muted. In a confusing and contradictory message, the African Union criticized the electoral process while also formally congratulating President Hassan on her victory. This leaves the Tanzanian people largely on their own. The future is uncertain. One path leads toward a consolidation of authoritarian rule, where elections are merely a performance. In this scenario, CCM would continue to rule, but the country's social fabric would be torn apart by simmering resentment. Another more hopeful path is that this uprising marks a fundamental shift in the nation's political consciousness. The protests have shown that despite years of repression, the spirit of defiance is alive and well, particularly among the youth. It has shattered the myth of Tanzanian exceptionalism and forced a national conversation about the country's democratic future. What's happening in Tanzania is a stark warning. You can't indefinitely suppress the will of the people. Denying citizens a voice at the ballot box only forces them to find it in the streets. The situation in Tanzania is evolving rapidly. What are your thoughts on this crisis? Do you see this as a turning point for democracy in the region? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe this story is important, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more analysis on the critical issues shaping our world.